Good morning, everyone. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming. It's a big day for UNCTAD. It's a big day for the UN. It is my distinct pleasure to open this meeting for the 15th Prebisch lecture. And without further ado, I would ask Secretary General Mugisa Kitui to make his opening remark. Mr. Secretary General.
Your Excellency, Mr. President, Your Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of UNCTAD, I would like to bid you all welcome to the 2014 Raúl Prebisch lecture. As many of you know, the Prebisch lecture commemorates UNCTAD's first Secretary General. It is appropriate in this 50th anniversary year that the lecture that we are returning to our intellectual roots in the intellectual leadership, the political economy leadership, and political leadership of Latin America. I am very honored to have His Excellency President Rafael Correa of Ecuador as our special presenter for this lecture today. Mr. President, you are the first sitting head of state to give the Prebisch lecture, and we are deeply honored to welcome you to UNCTAD. As I mentioned earlier on our meeting, I know you don't have very fond memories of Switzerland, since they were the first team to beat Ecuador at the World Cup this summer. But I can assure you that Swiss hospitality extends way beyond their soccer performance. Ladies and gentlemen, as you may all know, the first of the series of Prebisch lectures was delivered in 1982 by Raul Prebisch himself. During that lecture, he made statements that have a very, very clear resonance to the challenges we face today. He cautioned that the global economy was entering a period of secular stagnation with sluggish production, productive growth and investment growth, rising inequality, generating social structures and market incentives that privilege consumption over investment, leading to a global slowdown and social tensions. At this same lecture in 1982, Mr. Prebisch warned against irresponsible consumption of non-renewable natural resources, which will lead to a harmful environmental degradation. Today, we are all familiar with these dangers. Today, they are the most contemporary sense of what we are dealing with: stagnation in growth, rising inequality, and environmental threats. I mention this because from the very beginning, the Prebisch lecture represented thinking ahead of the times, what we have been calling being away ahead of the curve, and thinking of issues before they are contemporarily dominant in world discourse. We know that the notion of a one-size-fits-all is not a paradigm that can be appropriate in any prescription work that can be done. We at UNCTAD believe that the unique experiences of how one country deals with its unique circumstances, how a country's leadership owns the strategies they implement, is more important than any expert advice on dealing with the country's challenges. Today, we are eager to hear from President Correa how his government has put these important principles of reading from their own challenges and molding their own solutions in dealing with the challenges of Ecuador. It is my hope that today's lecture will offer all of us insights on how we can deal with the uniqueness of circumstance in each country, but also borrow from the thinking and emerging patterns for the whole world. But if I may finish with going back to Prebisch's lecture in 1982. Prebisch did warn us, and I want to quote his ending statement, that a return to political economy and not simply to brute economics is important to progress with hard effort through persuasion and explanation to action. He also insisted, and I quote, "It is not a question simply of a new international economic order, but of a new internal, ethical, and social order in each of the countries that is going to be driving how you reform." It seems to me that under President Correa's leadership, Ecuador has moved beyond brute economics and is looking to build an internal, ethical, and social order built around a more inclusive approach to community and more responsible approach to natural environment. It is my sincere hope, esteemed President, that the experience of development as a political process in Ecuador will offer valuable insights to all member states of UNCTAD and indeed to the international community as a whole. And like everybody else, I'm very eager to listen to your statement on how Ecuador is doing it, how you are thinking about doing it. But before I invite you to make your statement, I would like to indulge everybody that we have a brief video about the challenges and the situation in Ecuador today. Thank you very much for your attention.
There's nothing you can do that can't be done. Nothing you can sing that can't be sung. Nothing you can say, but you can learn how to play the game. It's easy. There's nothing you can make that can't be made. Nothing you can save that can't be saved. Nothing you can do, but you can learn how to be you in time. It's easy. All you need is love. All you need is love. All you need is love. Love. Love is all you need. All you need is love. All you need is love. All you need is love, love. Love is all you need. There's nothing you can know that isn't known. Nothing you can see that isn't shown. Nowhere you can be that isn't where you're meant to be. It's easy. Like nowhere else, all in one place, so close. All you need is Ecuador. Ecuador is all you need.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome President Correa.
Buenos días.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is such a pleasure to be here. The video wasn't about our current problems in Ecuador. It was about our ongoing situation. We're a beautiful country, and we await you all. The Secretary General talked about football and the World Cup. Let me talk about Argentina, Brazil, and Ecuador. The Argentinians say the Pope is Argentinian, and that's true. He's Argentinian. There's no doubt about that. Brazil is the eternal rival in football and other things. And then our dear friend Dilma, she answered that the Pope is Argentinian, certainly, but it's also true that God is Brazilian. And we answered in Ecuador that we had no difficulty with that. The Pope's Argentinian. It's very likely that God is Brazilian, but paradise is in Ecuador. So welcome to everybody to our paradise of Ecuador.
Quiero saludar
I would like to very respectfully and warmly welcome the Secretary General of UNCTAD, Mr. Kituyi, Mr. Michael Muller, Director General of UNOG, and Anik Moreno, former President of the Republic of Ecuador and Special Envoy for the United Nations on Disabilities and Accessibility. So my solidarity to you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the international bodies accredited in Switzerland, Mr. Humberto Jimenez, Permanent Representative of Ecuador to the WTO, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of international organizations, members, secretaries of state and government authorities of Ecuador, delegates, special guests and representatives of social bodies who have joined the Ecuadorian group here today, and my particular greetings to my fellow countrymen living in Switzerland. And thank you to all of you for being here this morning. The Secretary General was asking me how long I have to talk to you, to then move on to question and answers. And I said, as long as you like, sir. And Ernesto Samper of Colombia, the President, current Secretary General of UNASUR, was at an event, and he asked, how long do I have to speak? As long as you like, President, but we're all leaving in 30 minutes. So please, don't leave me here talking to myself. I'll try and keep things brief, but it is a long speech. But I'd be very happy to take questions afterwards. May I begin by doing what I always do, apologize to the interpreters and express my admiration. They do a fine job. But I'm called the torturer of the interpreters because I'm from a tropical country. I speak very fast, and it's practically impossible to keep up with me. So if I speak too fast, please make a sign, not too rude if possible, to see if I can manage to hold back the speed of my delivery. So thank you for being here. Thank you to UNCTAD for inviting me to the 15th event of the Prebisch lecture. This is a huge honor for me, as you can imagine. I trained in the structuralist school, the Latin American school. I was trained with the ideas of this extraordinary economist, outstanding Latin American economist, known throughout the world, Raúl Prebisch. And this event is part of the 50th anniversary of UNCTAD. I'm also told that it is the anniversary of the foundation of the United Nations. 70 years to be celebrated next year. So congratulations for this institution which represents hope for the world. And 50 years ago, UNCTAD was established to deal with matters relating to trade, development, finance, investment, science and technology. And the first Secretary General was Raúl Prebisch, in whose honor this event was established. To be able to talk about development as a political process in an academic forum of world standing during the Prebisch lecture is a huge privilege for me. And I'm doubly grateful because it allows me to return, although briefly, to the world of academia, which is where I feel happiest, most comfortable. I've always been a university professor in my professional life, and I would like to speak on the subject of political economy and economic development, which is my speciality. And let me begin with another joke. So, a joke that I always begin this type of lecture because it's very much in keeping with what we want to share with you. I don't know if you know that Christopher Columbus was considered the first economist. When he departed, he didn't know where he was going. When he arrived, he didn't know where he was. And it was all paid for by the government. So, if he had been an economist, or if an economist had traveled with him, although there were no economists at that time yet, but he would have concluded, or she would have concluded, that what we now call Latin America was going to develop more successfully than North America. In both regions, certainly, there were huge natural resources, but in the south, there were the Inca, Maya, Aztec civilizations were very advanced with huge technological knowledge. They had natural resources, civilizations, technical progress. But this is one of the great enigmas of development. We have so much more than in North America, but now north of the Rio Grande, how come it developed so fast, and in the south it didn't? Well, there are many replies, and it's very complex. It's one of the great enigmas of development. There are many different and complex responses, but one of the responses certainly is the type of dominant elite that in the past and in the present in Latin America. My friends, development is basically a political issue. The point of departure, the key question, is who is in charge of a society, the elites or the majorities? Capital or human beings? The market or society? The greatest harm that has been done to the economy, and I've studied it for many years, the greatest harm done to the economy is to have separated it from its original nature of being a political economy. We have been made to believe that it's all a technical issue, without bearing in mind the relations of power within societies. And so we have become a function of the dominant powers. To paraphrase the great economist John Kenneth Galbraith, the economist that doesn't analyze the matters of power is totally useless. That's the quote. Prebisch, as a professor of political economy, knew this, and he already said 30 years ago, and I quote, "We are living in a system of accumulation and distribution of income that is the result of a clash of forces and power relations, and not a rational plan of distribution of these resources on the basis of collective needs." That's the end of quote. That was an interview in 1979. So many academics are now discovering so-called the development is basically a political issue. An interesting analysis of the consequences of the domination of the elites and the institutions that are created to benefit themselves has been undertaken by Darren Acemoglu, a professor at MIT, and James Robinson, a professor of Harvard University, in his bestseller, Why Do Countries Fail?, in which, with a very successful or belated institutionalist and political economy approach, they demonstrate that institutions, policies and programs in a country depend on who holds power, although it would have sufficed to read Frédéric Bastiat, a French thinker, who 200 years ago already said, and I quote, "When looting becomes a way of living for a group of men who live in society, they create for themselves, with the passing of time, a legal system that authorizes them and a moral code that glorifies what they are doing." End of quote. Institutions, policies, and programs of a given country depend on who holds the reins of power. And Latin America has historically been dominated by elites that exclude from the benefits of progress the large majority of their fellow citizens. Poverty in Latin America is not the outcome of a lack of resources. With the current resources, with zero growth, we could eliminate poverty through redistribution. Poverty in Latin America is the result of inequity, and this in turn the result of the perverse relations of power, where the few dominate the many. And changing this balance of power in the service of the large majorities and through profoundly democratic processes, we are the Latin American country that is doing most to reduce inequality. We have brought down by 8 points income concentration as measured by the Gini coefficient. And this reduction is almost 3 times higher than the average in Latin America, which in turn is one of the few regions of the world that is reducing inequality. Everywhere in the world, in Europe, in the United States, inequality is increasing. In Latin America, we are reversing that trend. But there continues to be great inequality. And now in Ecuador, over the last 7 years, we've grown faster than the Latin American average. While the region grew by 3.4%, we achieved average growth of 4.3%. And this, even in the context of the crisis of 2009, which led to a 2 percentage point decline in growth in Latin America. And we, however, continue to grow a little, but we still continue to grow, even in that context of huge crisis, and this without a national currency. Because I'm sure many of you already know, after the crisis of 1999, our elites had the brilliant idea of eliminating the national currency and adopting the United States dollar as legal tender. So through dollarization is recessive, as you know. But nonetheless, we were able to grow during the crisis of 2009. 0.6%. The average growth of Ecuador has been considerably higher than the rest of the region. And as a result of economic growth and a reduction in inequality, we are also one of the 3 Latin American countries that has done and continues to do most to reduce poverty. It's an insult to humankind, this violence, as Gandhi said. Between 2006 and 2013, poverty declined by 37.6% to 25.6%, and extreme poverty, for the first time in history, stands below 2 figures, having declined from 16.9% to 8.6%. According to our planning for 2016, the end of my term of president, we hope that extreme poverty will have been reduced to only 3%, as in Chile, which is relatively the most developed country in Latin America, but just one poor person is one too many. As I said, it's the greatest insult to human dignity and to human rights, particularly in the 20th century, when poverty is not the result of any shortage of resources. It might have been in the Middle Ages with drought or flood, but no, it's the result of perverse and systems that exclude people. As you know, it's important not only to grow, it's, of course, that's very important in the context of development, but it's not only growth, because there can be growth that causes poverty, a growth that causes unemployment, a growth based on natural resources that are non-renewable, that then go outside the country and don't bring any well-being to the nationals. But our growth in Ecuador has been clearly pro-poor, pro-equality, pro-jobs. The state of development in Ecuador at the present time, and the majority of Latin American countries, is the best indicator of the soundness of economic policies. But we don't see this only in the growth rate. And even horrors as the country ratings, because that benefits capital, particularly financial capital. We need to look at the will and capacity of a country to pay its debts. That's what they look at. They don't look at the situation in the country for the people. If we had a life dictatorship that enslaves inhabitants and all surpluses were to serve to pay the foreign debt, you see that the country risk rating would be high, but you couldn't say it was sound economic policy. And so it all lies in the will of a country to service its debt. The best indicator of the quality of economic policies for a country with Ecuador's level of development is to see a decline in poverty, and particularly a decline in extreme poverty. Ecuador is also one of the Latin American economies with the lowest unemployment rate, 4.15% at the end of 2013, destroying the orthodox economy, because instead of reducing wages and sacrificing labor rights to supposedly generate jobs, we've increased. And now we have the highest real earnings in the Andean region, and we've done away with exploitation mechanisms such as labor tertiarization, which allowed a company through a third company to hire workers and thus avoid any kind of responsibility as an employer. For instance, when we came to power, the largest cement company in the country with 600 million sales per year, in a labor trial said that it had no workers because they were all tertiarized. During the long, sad, neoliberal night with the argument of enhancing competitiveness and with nice labels like labor flexibility, and that just serves as another word for labor exploitation. And so with this argument of enhancing competitiveness, our working class was sacrificed with a decline in real earnings and with labor exploitation mechanisms euphemistically called, as I said, labor flexibilization. Flexibilization in countries that maintained high levels of unemployment and didn't even provide any kind of unemployment insurance. Losing your job in Latin America means you're in the street. In Europe and other countries, you may get some kind of unemployment benefit, but not in our countries. And this compounded the terrible primary distribution of revenue between labor and capital, one of the main sources of inequality in Latin America. In Sweden, one of the most equitable countries in the world, for every dollar generated by the economy, 35 cents go to capital. That's remuneration of capital for entrepreneurs. Remuneration of physical capital and interest, financial capital, rent. And this against 65 cents that go to labor, that is, wages. But in Ecuador, we have the inverse distribution in favor of capital. Of course, we have a huge mixed sector where it's independent, where it's difficult to know how this distribution lies. But income-focused distribution is very bad in Latin America and one of the main sources of continuing inequality in the region. This situation has always been difficult to change because of the situation of labor exploitation it's not good with them, but it's worse without them because of the unemployment. In ECLAC, Alicia Barcel is working on these issues. In our legislation in Ecuador, we've always had a minimum wage. But we introduced another category, the dignified wage, defined as that which allows a family to emerge from poverty through family or household income. You can pay a minimum wage to avoid a greater evil, unemployment, but with the new legislation, no company can declare profits if they fail to pay a dignified wage to every last one of its employees. This means 100% distribution of profits to workers until all have reached this level of a dignified wage. After that, it can be the minimum wage. But until that level is reached, 100% of profits are distributed until everybody is receiving a dignified wage, so families can buy basic requirements and emerge from poverty. Some foretold the end of our production sector with the introduction of such measures. But the effects have been very surprising and have exceeded our expectations. Since it was introduced in 2011, average wages have increased. And this year, with no difficulties whatsoever, this is for the 2013, the minimum wage now is at the same level as this dignified wage. And for us, human work prevails over capital. But unlike traditional socialism, which proposed the cure was worse than the ill, modern socialism, on the contrary, uses modern instruments. Some of them are unprecedented, as in this case, and this to eliminate tensions between capital and labor. The most dignified and sustainable way of tackling poverty is to generate quality jobs with good wages, with Social Security. Social Security, indeed, coverage has doubled under our government from 26% to 43% of the economically active population between 2007 and 2013. This doubled in absolute terms. In relative terms, a little less than doubled, but still, a lot remains to be done. We're working on Social Security for housewives, because this is one of the major distortions of the capitalist models, the definition of the economically active population, people who are able and wishing to work. But what greater will and readiness to work and really carry out a socially beneficial task is that done by housewives. But since it's not a regular job in a given capitalization, in the capitalist system, they're considered not to be working. These housewives who work from dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, are supposedly not working according to the capitalist model. But we have a broader vision. We want to recognize all human work, and we believe that anybody who works during their lives is entitled to an appropriate retirement and pension. So we're looking at Social Security coverage for housewives. At the beginning of our government, through an able and intelligent management and technical rigor of our approach, we have repurchased our debt at a third of its value, and this reduced in the external debt from 24% in the budget in 2006 to 5.3% in 2013. The thousands of millions of dollars were thereby freed. Previously, they went into the pockets of those who provided our loans, and that was legitimate. And the nominal value is renegotiated each time, even though a third of the value was what prevailed in the market. We work on the market value. We also renegotiated the petroleum contracts, the so-called participation contracts that were drawn up in the 90s when a barrel of oil was worth $16 and where the state received only $4 or $5 per barrel. When oil prices shot up, the profits for the oil companies were phenomenal. We received practically nothing. Now we have service delivery contracts where the opposite occurs. A fixed rate per barrel is paid to the oil company on the basis of a reasonable profitability, and the remainder, regardless of the price, whether it's $12 or $14, depending on the extraction costs, then the remainder goes to the owner of the resource, namely the people of Ecuador. And before, the opposite occurred. And also, through a major efficiency in efficiency in tax gathering, we've tripled the amount of tax revenues, even though some taxes have been eliminated. So the Latin American policy is still very mean. If you listen to some people, they'll say too many taxes, but they say that the poor don't pay taxes. But we have low taxes in Ecuador. It's still below the Latin American average and well below the European average. Our value-added tax is 12%, the second lowest in Latin America. And the poor don't even pay that, because the basic food products and medicines do not pay VAT. And income tax with the deductions for health, education, you have to earn over $12,000. That's a high income in the region. That's when you start to pay income tax. But it's the power of the elites and the media, what Grams called the hegemonic culture, making people believe, making the poor believe that what's good for the elite is good for the poor. And many poor people believe that we have too many taxes, when nobody has found a way of redistributing better than having taxes fund education and health for all. And so that's one of the obstacles we still have to overcome in our region. We have reduced and even eliminated many taxes, but we have increased also our efficiency in gathering taxes. And we haven't increased the number of taxes that we're imposing. On the contrary. In 2006, since 2006, we have almost reached the Latin American average in Social Security coverage, but we're well below the OECD average that has over 30% average. And through this tripling of income, of tax income, and the renegotiation of oil contracts and the reduction in debt servicing costs through renegotiation, we have achieved the highest level of public investment in Latin America, about 15% of GDP for 2013. And some countries have huge fiscal deficits. They continue to become indebted, and the balance of the public debt versus GDP was 24%. In 2014, we hope we'll have 26% of debt coefficient to GDP. And this basically through savings, because we optimized earnings and minimized expenditure. And I don't want to compare this with some European countries, because people might get depressed. Greece, Spain, even the United States. We have the lowest coefficient in the region, and certainly the lowest in the history of the country. And this public investment has led to major transformations in roads, ports, airports, telecommunications, electricity grid, even the justice system. We didn't have judges or courts. Also, we've enhanced our citizen security and systemic competitiveness in general. And through this public investment that some criticize for ideological fundamentalism, indeed, this appears in some textbooks even. The crowding out effect of public investment is what they call it. Of course, there are extremes. If you are using all resources in the very short term, then if the state uses it, then there's less for the private sector. But under use of resources in the long term and medium term, then good public investment has in-crowding effects. For instance, when you build a road, you attract private investment. You don't drive it away. When you improve your electricity grid, you attract private investment. You don't drive it away. So that's one of the erroneous arguments presenting in traditional textbooks. And so we've enhanced our competitiveness with 15 points increase between 2012 and 2013, according to the World Economic Forum, indeed produced by the United Nations. And talking about fundamentalism, there are things that are actually in writing. I have textbooks that are outrageous, that posterity will not forget. There is such fundamentalism of demonizing public investment. There are famous laws called so-called fiscal prudence and transparency laws imposed by the IMF and by the World Bank throughout Latin America. For Ecuador, this law required a maximum 3.5% growth in real terms of public expenditure per year, except for servicing the debt. Now, what did that brilliant idea mean? It meant that we discovered uranium. If Bill Gates were to make a huge contribution, we couldn't build a hydroelectric plant because it was illegal under the rules. And what was the political economics behind these outrageous so-called technically sound policies? Well, there were two reasons. First, that everything should be done by the private sector, minimizing the public sector. And secondly, that all surplus should go to servicing the foreign debt, guarantee payment of the foreign debt. And even for many years in Ecuador, in Latin America, it was illegal to engage in public investment. You might want to control wage increases, but you have to pay your teachers, that has to increase, but also investment in roads, schools, infrastructure, that was all illegal, because public spending could only include by 3.5%, except for servicing the public debt. And on the subject of renegotiation of the foreign debt and of the oil contracts and the increase in tax gathering revenues, we were able to release major resources to pay the basic debt, that is the social debt. In 2006, 4.8% of GDP was allocated to the social sector, in comparison to 2013, where this figure has risen to 11.4%, and this in absolute terms is a fourfold increase. And this is important, my friends, because the use of social resources shows the balance of power within a society. When investment was banned, even to pay your teachers better, but there were no limits on paying foreign debt. When there was no money for education, even to replace the lights in operating theaters, that was a situation I encountered. But our oil was used to guarantee the payment of the foreign debt. There were special funds for that. A new oil pipeline was created when this law was enacted, and a trust fund was established using our oil to ensure payment of the foreign debt. That was unique in the world. If in the United Nations, if you give confidential information that will lead to an increase in profits, your earnings, insider trading, if you like, then you're enriching yourself. You'll be put in prison for doing that. In Ecuador, that's a law. But we had that fund based on the oil, and we said to the market, ladies and gentlemen, we have 600 million to buy bonds, and they were sold, and even with a premium at 25% of their nominal value. Foreign debt bonds were never bought, but the guarantee was enough to lead to an increase. And this was enacted in law in Ecuador. How are social funds allocated? If there isn't enough for health or education, but there's always enough for the paying the foreign debt, so that shows you who has power in a society. In this case, it was the creditors, the financial sector, that held the power. Now, facts and figures clearly show, without doubt, that whereas before it was the creditors, the bankers, the bureaucrats, the international bureaucrats who were in charge, now, okay, there's still a lot to do, but now it's the people of Ecuador who are in charge. And we have social achievements of which we are very proud. For example, to be the spearhead regionally and at the world level in policies for the inclusion of persons with disabilities, for whom we have achieved almost full employment. and this primarily through the fine work that has been done by our former Vice President, Mr. Lenin Moreno. According to the UN Human Development Index, Ecuador has departed from the middle-level development, human development group to the high level of human development. I'm not quite sure that that's correct. We haven't yet achieved that high human development level, but we are certainly progressing, and the logical consequence of these achievements is the political stability in the country. Following the terrible crisis in Ecuador in 1999, which was the outcome of the neoliberal fundamentalism, the financial deregulation of 1994, when it was said that the market would regulate itself all on its own, and we're still paying for that crisis. And as a result, that we had such instability that until 2007, no government had fulfilled its full term in 10 years. From 98 to 2007, we had 7 presidents. Ecuador was an example of all that could be bad in a country. Today, Ecuador is one of the most stable democracies in the continent. Since 2006, the citizen revolution, as we call our political project, has won 10 elections consecutively, including 2 presidential elections of only 1 round. And as you see, formal democracy has been consolidated, but also real democracy, that of access to rights, equality of opportunity, and dignified living conditions. This is the so-called Ecuadorian miracle. But I hope the young people were listening to me. I believe, but I don't believe in economic miracles. In development, there are no miracles. The major changes that have been achieved in Ecuador are basically the outcome of a change in the balance of power relations. Now in Ecuador, and I repeat this, despite all our problems, it is the people of Ecuador who hold the reins of power. However, capital continues to dominate, what I call the empire of capital, particularly financial. The rule of capital is dollars. It's not weapons. In 2008, again, lack of regulation, oversight, and intervention capacity in the international financial system, primarily in the United States, led to one of the gravest economic and political crises of recent decades. It led to a reduction in the value of the assets in the hands of the middle class, principally their homes. But paradoxically, following the crisis, the fortunes of the richest and the profits of the banks are at record level, while the earnings of families have only just returned to their levels prior to the crisis. And this is also what is at the root of the European crisis. Everything depends on financial capital, with the complicity of so-called economic science and financial bureaucracies at the international level. Ideology is dressed up as science. The austerity measures continue to be preached. The so-called Hoover policies continue to be applied in reference to Herbert Hoover, the U.S. president, who at the beginning of the U.S. Great Depression, the end of the 20s, the early 30s of last century, he compounded the crisis with measures of this type. Why don't we do why do we continue to repeat the same thing? It's because it's not a technical problem, it's a political one. The solution of the crisis is through restoring control by citizens of capital and the control by society of markets. And the solution of the crisis, and I address the young here, is primarily a political issue. And what about development? That's somewhat more complicated. It's not just political. There has to be this change in the balance of power, but that's not enough in itself. There are many conditions, however, that intervene to achieve development. Power may be in the hands of the majority. A fairer distribution of social resources may be achieved. But what if there's only poverty to distribute? And then human talent, science, technology, and innovation, which would serve to generate capacity and wealth, these are also fundamental and essential to achieve development. For us, education as a right and a way of generating human talent, that's what's most important. Education lies at the heart. In absolute terms, we now invest 4.3 times more in education than before our government. But we also invest 4.5 times more in health. Health and education are so closely linked. A sick child is not going to learn well. And through the public investments in construction of schools, and through the elimination of barriers to access to education, you used to have to pay an enrollment fee, for instance, and now not only do you not pay that, but also books, uniforms, meals are free. So through these measures, we, 2 or 3 years early, have achieved some of the Millennium Development Goals proposed by the United Nations for 2015, for instance, universal enrollment in basic education.
No solo es lo más importante.
Education is not just vitally important to us. We would go as far as to believe it to be the cornerstone of democracy itself. Democracy is based on high-quality public education as well as on mass access or universal access to education that is absolutely free of cost. We're also working hard to bed down a culture of quality and excellence, where assessments of institutions, teachers and students are ongoing. Given that we're meeting here this morning in Switzerland, allow me to give you an example of what I mean. We have an agreement unique in the world with the Swiss organization Bachillerato Internacional. And this is an organization for the International Baccalaureate Award given in high schools. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. You can find international baccalaureate programs around the world: Argentina, China, Ecuador, the United States of America. And it's a set international award, which means that you can compare the attainment and achievement of students from countries around the world because they've all taken the same award, the same examination. So we have this agreement with the Swiss organization International Baccalaureate, so that by 2017, 500 public education institutions will be certified by that organization and will thus be allowed to award international baccalaureate certificates. This is unique, and we would have increased the number of institutions that could have enjoyed this ability toward international baccalaureates, but unfortunately we had already used up all the capacity of the Swiss organization Baccalaureate International. So 82 public education institutions have already achieved the necessary status. 220 are going through the accreditation process, and we hope that by 2017 we will have the 500 public education institutions able to award this certificate. This is unprecedented. We have never had such a high level of international baccalaureate availability in our country before. We only had 17 public schools who could provide this in the history of our country before we took this decision to work with this organization. So that's all well and good, but the key to quality education is teachers, the Socrates of the system, if you will. You can have all the technology, the textbooks, etc. that you need, but if you don't have quality teachers, nothing will change. In order to make sure that we deliver quality teaching, we've substantially increased the salaries for teachers, and through our National Education University, we're seeking to achieve, boost the level of academic attainment for our teachers. We have raised the requirement for the number of degree points that you must gain at high school in order to become a teacher, in order to go to university to study as a teacher. So we have a scale of 1,000 points, if you will, that can be gained through your high school exams, and the teachers have to get almost as many points as doctors do. In Ecuador, we have also adopted an aggressive national policy to promote science, technology, and innovation. And this is incredibly important when you bear in mind that one of the most serious problems faced by my country is the low level of productivity of our economy. As I say time and time again, we are not falling into the trap of technological absolutism, which is a belief whereby society has to obey their technological needs, and they are slaves, if you will, to their technology. Echoing what Albert Einstein had to say, I fear the day in which technology replaces human interaction. The world will end up with a generation of idiots. That said, nor do we believe in a primitive infantilism or childishness, if you will, a theory according to which pre-modernity can be erroneously equated to our concept of buen vivir or good living, and poverty is part of folklore. And I would go further. Such fundamentalism, which verges on irresponsibility, gives rise to a new and unjust international division of labor, as I will refer to later in my speech. Given the impressive rise in knowledge generation at the global level, those countries that don't create or generate such knowledge will be increasingly ignorant in relative terms and more dependent on the knowledge generated by others. For these reasons, higher education has been one of the key concerns of my government, and over the last 7 years we have increased the budget allocation for the tertiary education sector from 1.1% to 2% of GDP, more than double the Latin American average, which stands at 0.8%, I believe, and indeed higher than the average for OECD countries. Their average investment in higher education hovers around 1.7%. Here it says 1.8% as the GDP investment for Ecuador, but that's from last year. We've almost reached 2% as of this year. So the average for Latin America is 0.8%. On the chart for the OECD, it's 1.3%. I believe by this year, again, it'll be slightly higher in the OECD. And again, for Ecuador, it's higher than 1.8% that you see on the chart there, and it's around 2%. We have invested almost as much as Denmark and as Qatar. Qatar is the country which invests the most in education in terms of GDP around the world. I have been able to visit Qatar, and it's very impressive what they're doing there. But they also have a lot of money with which to do it. But they're investing it wisely. They're not just squandering it. In Ecuador, between 1992 and 2006, in other words, during the long and sad, dark times of the neoliberal epoch in my country, and in scarcely more than 14 years, 45 universities were created, so that we have an overall total of 71 universities at the national level as of 2006. Now, formally and on paper, these institutions were non-profit organizations, but in reality they were for nothing but profit. They had a very poor academic record. The teaching was often improvised and very sketchy, and for that reason they were popularly known as workshops, mechanics, garages, training places, because the academic attainment was not as high as it should be. Thanks to the laws that we have enacted, we've been able to carry out a deep-rooted evaluation of all the universities. As a result, 14 universities not worthy of the name were closed. So this is an indication of just how much we're investing in our higher education system, that we would go as far as to close 14 universities because of failures in academic attainment is, I hope, proof of this. We're also seeking to improve the quality of universities in our country. It's sad to say that there is not a single Latin American university in the 100 best universities of the world. So this is a challenge not just for Ecuador, but for Latin America as a whole. We don't have the same tradition of higher technical education, so we've learned a lot from Europe, for example, from Germany in particular, and we're intending to invest more than $300 million to strengthen or indeed open dozens of technical institutes which are strategically located around the country and will have very close links with the productive sector to make sure we're training people in the skills that they genuinely need. Ecuador currently sponsors 10,000 scholarship students around the world. The majority of them have now received or are currently studying for their masters and doctorates in some of the best universities in the world. The investment in 10,000 scholarship students represents the highest investment with regards to GDP in grants for all of Latin America.
Seguramente el que empezó a aplaudir el becario no es.
Thank you very much for that applause for the scholarship students. It's them who deserve it, not I. But over the last 7 years, we have granted more scholarships than were granted in the whole history of Ecuador before our government came to power. And the majority of these scholarship students who've enjoyed these grants have gone on to become university professors, thus boosting that quality of education we can deliver for future generations. Alongside improvements in educational quality, we have been able to double the number of students from the poorest segments of society, particularly from those segments of society who are historically excluded from higher education, particularly indigenous peoples and Afro-Ecuadorians. According to the Economic Commission for Latin America, CEPAL, Ecuador has become the country with the highest percentage of graduating students from the poorest quintile of the population when compared with the rest of the region. So we have broken down or done away with the historic and classic quandary of whether you choose equality or quality. We have shown that both principles can coexist side by side harmoniously, and that the zero-sum game that was entered into previously is a fallacy. We have achieved what we have managed to achieve, particularly amongst the poorest in society, because we have made constitutional provision that higher education will be free of charge. It will bear no cost. And we have managed to do this for the poorest in society because we have a broad financial aid program. And we also, thanks to our new admission system for higher education, to make sure that we can look not just academic attainment but also aptitude. We can have interviews with people from the rural and urban areas so that people can enter university on their aptitude, on their knowledge, and that it is not dependent upon their ability to pay or having the right kind of paper from the right school as was the case in the past. We have set up 4 new public universities that meet global standards in key disciplinary areas key for the development of the country, such as the health sciences, biosciences, teaching and the arts. We are in particular focusing on what was previously known the life sciences when I talk about biosciences or bio-knowledge, and that's of course key to our country because we are covered by the Amazon rainforest, which is the key environmental asset of the world. And so it's important that we have this focus on the biosciences as well, because it is right there on our doorstep, but we're also focusing on issues such as the arts, as I've said. I referred earlier to the work of Asemalogo and Robinson, who did not just omit or fail to acknowledge, but rather categorically rejected the cultural factor as a determinant for development. They focused on a predetermined set of formal institutions, irrespective of the cultural, historical context of a country and the external restrictions. And on the basis of their research, you could have the same set of institutions, the same requirements for institutions for Ecuador or for Switzerland. There should make no difference, even though these are different countries in different parts of the world. This is a serious error in which to fall. There are few things that are so important to development as cultural change. We all do what we do. We all act, consciously or unconsciously, influenced by the cultural framework in which we live, understood as a set of ideas, beliefs, visions, and values that are transmitted socially from generation to generation. And so you can enact laws, legislation, but that will do little to change cultural attitudes. culture stemming from informal institutions, informal setup from family, etc., will frequently dominate a formal attempt to instruct in culture. The cultural focus environment to explain development as a framework for development has been used as a theory since at least 1905, where it was referred to by Max Weber in his book Protestant Ethics and the Capitalist Spirit. And it's clear that in a culture of innovation, of willingness to tackle risks, of responsibility and excellence, and ability to overcome paternalism and victimhood, fosters development and at the same time creates technology and innovation. All societies and cultures have their values and indeed their anti-values. For example, perhaps because of the hardships encountered in their lives, I believe that Latin Americans would be much more prepared than North Americans to be able to withstand extreme conditions. To give an example, were a North American and a Latin American to lose themselves in the jungle, it would probably be the latter who 1 year later would have survived. The problem is that if 200 North Americans and 200 Latin Americans got lost in the jungle, after a year, the first group, the 200 North Americans, would have their schools, they would have their farms, their harvests, even their church, whilst the Latin Americans would still be arguing about who is to be the boss.
Me alegro que aplauda.
Thank you for the applause. Because often we don't like self-criticism, and I know there are many Latin Americans in the room. There are many of us who don't like self-criticism. It's not just a Latin American failing. This collective action, organized and planned on the basis of solidarity and because of recognition of our interest, is still at the nascent stage in Latin America. We are the champions when it comes to talking about solidarity. Examples thereof such as paying for farm labor in food or in kind, living together in community. But we have to be efficient as well. If I could give an example of what I mean once again. If, for example, in Latin America, a house caught fire, the neighbors would throw themselves into putting that fire out, filling the buckets, risking their lives to put it out. And to try and put it out. They wouldn't succeed, probably. But what solidarity they would have shown, what community spirit. Anglo-Saxons, on the other hand, pay taxes. Therefore, they have a professional firefighting unit. If a house fire breaks out, the firefighters come, they put out the fire. Nobody talks about solidarity or fellowship. But on the other hand, the house has been saved. One thing I admire a great deal in the Anglo-Saxon world is their pragmatism and their sense of responsibility. If someone commits an error or makes a mistake, they carry out the necessary analysis into what happened. They apply sanctions proper to the case where necessary, and above all, they take the necessary corrective measures so that it won't happen again. If in Latin America a mistake is made, then we will throw stones at the United States Embassy. In other words, it's never our fault, it's always the fault of other people. And in this way, behaving in this way, we're not accepting or shouldering responsibility. Still less are we taking corrective action. And to quote Einstein once again, if you do the same thing over and over again, you will end up with the same results over and over again. Now, this attitude has been exacerbated by a poor understanding of the theory of dependence. If we are poor because they are rich, it is us who are good and it is they who have to change. We don't have to change at all because we may be poor but we are good. If I can continue with the example I just gave of the Latin Americans lost in the jungle, in the face of the evidence of underdevelopment, we make of vices virtues and say that they might be richer, but we are more democratic. Nonetheless, the minute you take your eyes off those 200 Latin Americans, many of them will escape to live in an Anglo-Saxon neighborhood. This lack of an ability to self-criticize and lack of a willingness to change is particularly present, unfortunately, amongst our indigenous brothers, who are without doubt, let it be said, the victims of historical injustices. Empathy, solidarity, and indeed indignation in the light of the centuries-long exclusion that they have faced often leads us to idolize the indigenous world. This is a serious error. Victims do not necessarily have moral supremacy over those who have not been victimized. The fact that you were the subject of serious and grave injustices doesn't mean that you are wiser than anybody else. And finally, Having been a victim does not excuse you from taking responsibility for your current situation and circumstances. This victimization and the corresponding paternalism attitude that arose to serve it have paralyzed our ancestral peoples, and this probably represents the worst form of racism because it is related to our frequent underestimation of the abilities of the aforementioned indigenous peoples. And there is a whole school of apologetics for the resistance shown by these indigenous peoples, but not a resistance to rights or to enjoying rights, but rather they have historically resisted change. They have made of an unwillingness to change, an immobility, a virtue. They believe that they can change things without actually changing anything. This is simply impossible. And more seriously still, they frequently believe that poverty is part of culture. And the challenge of our ancestral peoples is to change, to overcome poverty, to refuse to believe that anymore without losing our identity. Unfortunately, some cultural anti-values can prevail and become mechanisms for under and sub-development. Now, in addition to changes in the internal power structure of a society and changes in culture, we need changes in the power relationships at the international level as well. Given that, there can be no doubt that there are serious external restrictions, neo-dependency and neo-colonialism, for example, which hamper the development of our peoples. This is another factor that is glaring in its absence from the analysis put together by Acemoglu and Robinson, but it was considered in depth in the post-war period by the Latin American structuralist school. And here I refer once again to the work of Raul Prebisch, who demonstrated that the role that has been granted to us since our independence has been to be at the bottom of the ladder of the International Division of Labor. He indicated that unequal trade flows and exchanges, expressed in the deterioration of trade terms, all result from the strategy of ISI, or import substitution industrialization. Prebisch said that the countries of the Third World have fallen into a state of dependence on the First World, becoming producers of raw materials in an orbiting relationship similar to that of the rural areas around their glittering capital city. So these countries can move to the path of sustained development. It is necessary that we allow them to exercise a certain level of protectionism in terms of foreign trade and strategies of import substitution. This classic division of work or of production has to some extent been overcome. But now we have to tackle new and equally unjust forms of the international division of labor and of market access. If previously underdeveloped countries simply produce raw materials and developed countries high added value industrial goods, today developed countries create knowledge that they privatize, and our environmental assets in the developing world are freely available to everyone. Knowledge in general is a public good. In other words, technically speaking, there is no ability to exclude in consumption. To give you an example of what I mean, it's very easy to copy software, but if we don't copy it because it's patented, you have to pay the royalties and you can be punished. So we put in place institutional barriers. But on the other hand, if I use the software, well, anybody else can use it as well. In other words, there's no rivalry in the consumption. Privatizing a public good through institutional measures such as patents is prejudicial to any society, because if there's no rivalry in consumption, if everybody can consume the good, then the higher the number of people who can enjoy a good, then the better the corresponding levels of social well-being. This is one of the famous market failures, if you will. A dramatic example of the privatization of knowledge and of forced exclusion is the high cost of certain medicines. It isn't actually very expensive to reproduce a medicine, but they're patented, so it becomes very expensive to buy them and you can't reproduce them, and that can often mean the difference between life and death. The fact that I use a medicine doesn't mean that somebody else can't use it in exactly the same way. If they use it, I won't. But because we have this privatization of knowledge, then we end up with such social inefficiencies, and indeed it is nothing less than the subjecting of human beings, living, breathing human beings, to capital. There are more efficient and effective ways of incentivizing knowledge generation and creation. One alternative would be greater participation of the academic world and of the public sector. Another option is for the state to compensate for knowledge creation for profit gains by making it available to the whole of humanity. So, for example, you can pay a reasonable profit to those who came up with the medicine, who invented it, and then make it available to reasonable cost to the whole of society, to the entire population. However, the major problem with these alternatives that I've just outlined is that they would end up undermining fundamental ideologies and the empire of capitalism, which I previously referred to. However, whilst it's mainly rich countries that produce science and technology, our countries, the countries of the Amazon basin in particular, also produce public goods, but these are environmental public goods. However, for all the huge quantities of pure and fresh air generated by the Amazon rainforest, which are the lungs of the planet, and without which we would see the human condition deteriorate seriously, we, the countries of the Amazon basin, do not receive a single penny on compensation, whilst the largest global polluters pay nothing for consuming our environmental goods. Sometimes I believe that the production or the generation of environmental goods has no cost attached to it, but the reality is that it can be very costly indeed, not in terms of direct costs, but rather in what economists call the opportunity cost, in other words, the relevant cost. There are many who call upon us today that we should stop exploiting or mining for oil in the Amazon region. That would save the environment, of course, but it would imply a huge cost in terms of future income not received, and would mean that every day we would have more and more children unable to go to school. We would have increasing number of communities without safe drinking water, and people dying of diseases which we are perfectly able to cure. This would be what we would end up in, this pathology of poverty. This is the new international labor division, or market division, that we're seeing. And it's a political problem. It's a problem of power relationships at the international level. To give an example of what I mean, take a moment to imagine if the situation was the reverse, and those who created or generated environmental goods were the rich countries of the world, and our countries were also the polluters as well. There can be no doubt that we would have been invaded in order to oblige us at gunpoint to pay fair compensation, and all of this in the name of civilization, rights, etc. Dear friends, the current global order is not just unjust, it's also immoral. It's all put together to serve the interests of the most powerful, and there is a wealth of double standards I could point to. Global public goods produced by poor countries, such as environmental goods or environmental assets, should be free. There should be no charge attached to their use, whilst public goods or assets produced by developed and capitalist countries should be paid for, and they are paid for through the imposition of institutional barriers such as patents. Simply paying for the environmental goods that we all use would lead to an unprecedented redistribution of wealth and income at the global level. But this is once again an issue of power relationships, and this time once again at the international level. The major polluters of the world did not sign the Kyoto Protocol, but in our country you can end up in jail if you don't pay the royalties for a patented product. And let me say in passing that the prison for those who fail to make royalty payments is right next door to the debtors' prison. In Ecuador, we tried to close the prison for those who failed to make their royalty or patent payments, and in response to that, the WTO tried to sanction us. These are the sovereign limits placed upon the action of our countries. The saddest thing of all is that it's often we poor countries ourselves who enthusiastically participate in these absurd mechanisms, and we don't really even understand the instruments that are being used by others to keep us down, to make sure that we don't break away from the role assigned to us by this new economic, financial and labor order. For example, as stated by our dear friend Álvaro García Linera, the Vice President of Bolivia and one of the giants of Latin American thinking and philosophy of our time, various NGOs are not really non-governmental organizations, but rather organizations of other governments operating in our territory as a vehicle for the introduction of a type of colonial environmentalism, which relegates indigenous peoples to the simple role of custodians of the Amazon rainforest. End of quote. In our countries, we have a nascent and rather childish environmental mindset, environmental activists who believe that stopping mining or drilling for oil has to be done because that way we will avoid wasting our non-renewable natural resources. But to do so would be social suicide, which would lead to the breakdown of any political project of any government in power around the region. Argentina, Uruguay, Peru, Ecuador. We can't take such an abrupt and brutal step. We need to make this very clear as Latin Americans. Our best opportunity for development whilst safeguarding our sovereignty is our natural resources. Thanks to the availability of natural resources, we can avoid the painful step of exploitation of the labor force which the countries of Southeast Asia had to go through. For example, when businessmen in my country complain to me because they have to pay the highest wages in the Andean region, I respond to them, you also enjoy the cheapest energy prices in the region, and this is thanks to our non-renewable natural resources and our ability to use them. In addition, adopting the stance of this childish approach to environmental matters would leave us exposed to the new and unjust international division of labor and economy that I have mentioned repeatedly previously, and would condemn our people to perpetual poverty, which would be unfair when you take into account that Ecuador, even though it exploits its natural resources, is one of the lowest polluters in the world. Moving away from a purely natural resource-based economic model is not achieved by this childish choice of just stopping it altogether, which I would say is verging on irresponsibility, this refusal to take advantage of natural resources at all, but rather we need to take the income generated from the natural resource sector, from the mining sector, etc., to develop other sectors of the economy. We need to invest it in education, in our human talent, in science and technology. We need to use the mining industry to be able to move away from the mining industry, to be able to move away from an economy based on finite resources to an economy based on infinite resources, in other words, based on human talent and on knowledge, but without taking the absurd and dangerous step of refusing to make use of our natural resources, which would mean that we would simply end up as beggars seated on sacks of gold. And we need to make sure that we do all that I've just outlined, use our natural resources widely and invest in other sectors without subjecting ourselves to this new unfair international division of labor, international model of finance that some are seeking to impose upon us. We are perfectly aware of our limitations as a small country, and that we cannot change an unjust and unfair and immoral global order ourselves. But nor are we going to passively accept the role that has been assigned to us in this new economic model, or in the economic model of the post-war. This brings me, I believe, to UNCTAD and the particular role that we have therewith. Today, there is an attempt that takes many guises, which brings to bear much pressure, pushing liberalization at all costs. Ladies and gentlemen, this idea that free trade, unfettered trade, liberalization at all costs would benefit for one and all, for once and for all, is a fallacy. It is something that is most closer to a religious belief than anything that can be proven by science, and would not stand up to any scrutiny of its theory or of its history. This was very well understood by Prebisch, who made it clear, and I agree, that the ISI strategy, the import substitution industrialization strategy, failed not because the concept was bad, but because it was badly implemented. Nonetheless, it was the model implemented by much of Europe, much of Asia. In his extraordinary book, Kicking Away the Ladder, Development Strategy and Historical Perspective, written by Chang Ha-jun, a book published in 2002, and Chang Ha-jun is a Korean researcher based in the University of Cambridge. He demonstrated how almost all developed countries did in history exactly the reverse of that which they are now preaching that developing countries should do. As far as free trade is concerned, Mr. Chang established that, quite contrary to what is today preached, the promotion of the nascent industry in currently developed countries has been the key to the development of the majority of nations, and the exceptions have only been small countries that are within or very close to the borders of global technology, such as the Netherlands and Switzerland. Chang also indicated in an interesting historical revision that it was Alexander Hamilton and not Friedrich List, as is normally thought, who in 1791, in his capacity as Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, presented for the first time in a systemized way the argument of the nascent industry and its needs to justify industrial protectionism in this country, namely the United States of America, particularly to combat the free trade drive of the imperialist power at that time, which was the United Kingdom. And only when the US industrial supremacy was established absolutely after the Second World War with the descent of the United Kingdom, the United States, which occupied the role previously occupied by the United Kingdom in the 19th century, began to promote the same idea that the British Empire promoted in the 19th century, free trade, despite having achieved its own industrial and financial supremacy thanks to an intense and nationalistic industrial protection of its own industries. In conclusion, in the history of development, there have been few things that have been so strange and indeed so counter to historical example as the overly simplistic idea of free trade. And developing countries need to do what rich countries did when they were at our own current status of development, things that they won't allow us to do now that they are the champions of competitiveness at the global level. Free trade is not something I stand counter to in absolute terms, but we need to be allowed to arrive at in a position where we can adopt free trade by following the same steps that countries that currently promote free trade did in their history.
The
existence of an international market in a deficit of power and given the correct prices to all commodities continues to be a fantasy. And as Paul Krugman said, Nobel Prize for Economy in 2008, it is clear that the classical and idealized theoretical model to justify free trade is no longer valid in practice. The simplicity of the comparative advantages as a strategy for development for the poorest country is in fact a rejection of the majority of what we know as economic development. We've talked a lot about globalization, but it is a globalization that doesn't quest for global citizens, only global consumers. It doesn't seek to create a global society, but only global markets, and that without appropriate oversight and governance mechanisms, it can destroy countries, as has occurred. Priorities given to financial liberalization and also liberalization of assets, supposedly based on the market theory, that is the free mobility of factors and assets to achieve efficiency. But what is inconsistent is that human mobility is increasingly criminalized. Indeed, it is a globalization under the rule of capital, and particularly financial capital. I'm thinking of an analogy of neoliberal globalization with wildcat capitalism of the 18th century, when the Industrial Revolution began, when workers died before their machines, when they worked 7 days a week, up to 16 hours a day. So how to put an end to such exploitation? Well, it was with the consolidation of national states and through collective action that imposed limits on these abuses and better distributed the fruits of technical progress. And this world collective action doesn't exist in neoliberal globalization, and similar excesses are occurring, as in the wildcat capitalism of the Industrial Revolution, when, for instance, to compete on global markets, the poorest countries have to impose precarious conditions on their workers, and only through day-by-day changes in the world are we going to be able to increase production in countries like Ecuador. Mobility of speculative capital means that small and open country economies have become little paper boats in a huge storm. It is impossible for small and developing countries to achieve stability and growth and jobs with the volatility of capital. Indeed, the high mobility of capital is one of the most criticized characteristics of neoliberal economic globalization, precisely for the loss of national policies and also the huge destruction wrought by international financial speculation in developing countries. And in developed countries, in fact, I might say in passing, crises are frequently not the consequence of direct actions in the countries where they occur, but they are the result of what is done or not done by other countries. And they can even be the product of the mood of international investors to reduce volatility of capital. Many economists, and for many years already, have been denouncing the need to throw sand in the wheels of globalization. That is, erect barriers to reduce the volatility of capital. In fact, James Tobin, who won the Nobel Prize for Economy in 1981, he already 20 years ago said that it was necessary to establish a tax on international capital flows. The Tobin tax would not only have effects in terms of reducing the volatility of these flows, but would also mean that the amounts gathered would serve to finance the development projects. Of course, given the orientation of neoliberal globalization, when everything is dependent on capital, and particularly financial capital, and at its service, then these proposals have been broadly ignored. Again, we're talking about the role of capital here. But there are other types of external restrictions faced by developing countries, and UNCTAD should be dealing with these too. New forms of colonialism, open cases of neocolonialism, such as, for example, these so-called attacks on our sovereignty, these called reciprocal investment protection treaties, where capital has more rights than human beings, where any transnational can take a sovereign country to arbitration without having to exhaust all domestic remedies, in fact, without even applying to any. If you in America wish to apply to the Inter-American human rights bodies, you must first exhaust domestic remedies. But a transnational, under these treaties, protection treaties, can directly take a sovereign state to arbitration without any former measures to be met, and these lead to terrible aberrations. These reciprocal investment protection treaties were imposed in the 1990s during the dark night of neoliberalism, and they are an attack on the sovereignty of our countries. The report published by the Transnational Institute and the Corporate Europe Observatory, entitled "When Injustice is a Business," states that a small group of legal academics, arbitrators and financial speculators in their own interest feed an upsurge of arbitration that costs thousands of millions of dollars, and these same groups oppose any type of reform that is in the public interest. This is a huge business, and the arbitrators themselves, the judges deal with maybe 10 or 15 cases. They might earn 200, 300,000 cases, and so it's very bad business to stand down as judge. There are terrible conflicts of interest in these situations. An investigation is being undertaken on these practices, and people will be very surprised by the outcome. These are arbitrators who come and go from the offices of the transnationals, and particularly the oil transnationals. One of the authors of the report states that a group of arbitrators use their influence to guarantee that the rules in the system benefit investors, and that claims against governments continue to generate millions of dollars. End of quote. Because the two main centers of arbitration are in competition with each other also. So we have the UNCTAD rules so the United Nations and UNCTAD need to look at this. So there is a competition to see who can get more cases. And so a very juicy business leading to huge conflict of interests and terrible aberrations, always in the favor of capital and against the interests of our states. All the countries harmed by transnationals are getting organized to join together to combat such exploitation. Now, I don't want to take more of your time, but there are terrible cases. There was Occidente in our country where the contract ended. And the court says that the state was right in Ecuador, but that there has to be compensation paid anyway. So that's interfering in the sovereign, or the law of a sovereign country. And there are reciprocal arrangements. There is a bilateral treaty with the United States. Imagine an ad hoc tribunal saying that the U.S. law is very, very harsh and that the culprit shouldn't be penalized. The Chevron case, for instance, which destroyed our Amazon. And we were tried in The Hague under the reciprocal investment protection system. But Chevron is accused. It bought Texaco. That stopped working in our country in 1992, and the treaty is from 1997. So the judges considered they could hear the case applying a treaty in retroactive form. So of course there are conflicts between states and companies, but there are also conflicts between private entities. But now we just need to see pink elephants fly, because the elephants have been very much in evidence already. So this is a terribly unjust world and immoral world. But we do have responses, and here integration has a fundamental role to play. One of our main proposals in the Union of Southern Countries, UNASUR, is the establishment of the South American Arbitration Center. Nobody says that we don't need to guarantee investment, but we need to guarantee the rights of our nations as well. And so in UNASUR, we are establishing a regional arbitration center, separate. And it's not going to be the transnational imposing their conditions. If we're united, we will impose the conditions on international capital. But I repeat, the world order not only is unjust, but it's also immoral. If there's something that I've learned in these 8 years as president, it's that the world is dominated by capital, and the interest of the hegemonic countries dominated also by this capital. And while this situation remains unchanged, we will have restricted democracies or openly fictitious democracies with a lack of good governance in weak countries and an absence of governance at the world level also. In the 21st century, the great challenge to mankind is a political struggle that begins by releasing the large majorities from the domination of the elites to achieve the supremacy of human beings over capital, of societies over the market, and our nations over the interests of the hegemonic countries and transnational capital. Our homeland, as we call our united Latin America, is not just a dream of our leaders, but it is in fact the only way to obtain our second and lasting independence. With integration, we must boost our capacity and defend ourselves from neocolonialism and the unjust world order. The community of Latin American and Caribbean states, CELAC, has a huge opportunity and hope to forge our own spaces for dealing with regional conflicts and maintaining the Organization of American States. Based in Washington, with a criminal blockade on Cuba that is contrary to all human rights and law. So maintaining the Organization of American States so that, like CELAC, the Latin American countries as a bloc, we can deal with our conflicts with North America. The world of the future will be a world of blocs. In UNASUR, we account for some 500 million individuals, 17 million square kilometers. Just by becoming united, we would become the fourth largest economy in the world, with 5.9% of world GDP, a third of sources of drinking water in the planet, and the leading place in the world production of food, and with hydrocarbon reserves for the next 100 years. Within UNASUR, the new regional financial architecture will be studied in the future. Our new regional financial architecture, it is the way of resolving one of the greatest paradoxes of the countries of the Sur, with the South. We have $760 million of our resources deposited in the first world, but we continue to depend on foreign loans and foreign investment. This is a transfer of liquidity, but also of wealth towards the richest countries of the world, because we see 0.5% of yield, but we have to ask to borrow our own cash at 7 or 8%. And so we must learn to take advantage of our savings and allocate it to investment in our own region. And that's why we need the Bank of the South and the South Fund. Also, we need exchange mechanisms to minimize the use of extra-regional currencies. And why not? In the medium term, we might have a physical regional currency, maybe. But what is clear is that it's absurd to trade in a currency that's from outside our region, which increases our vulnerability and transfers wealth outside our country. This, like in feudal times. So if we're dollarized, then the US printing dollars actually benefits from our wealth. And we need to change the unjust division of labor. There must be compensation for provision of environmental assets. And together, we can become generators of knowledge, for instance, by coordinating our research agendas. The best way to free ourselves from the rule of capital is through integration, to achieve such simple, straightforward things as regional minimum wages that prevent the absurd competition between our countries. That is to the benefit of transnational capital. And as a bloc, we can have an effect in changing the unjust and immoral world order. Ecuador will be chairing CELAC next year, and we will have the following proposal: planning integration, the new regional financial architecture, regulation of transnational capital, and essentially the guarantee of human rights. And I personally restate what I said in 2009 when I was pro tempore president of UNASUR. I said, perhaps the Europeans will have to explain to their children why they united, but we will have to explain to our children why it took us so long.
Queridos estudiantes, jóvenes, amigas, amigos.
friends, students, young people, as you see, I believe in human talent that brings the desert to flower and to make it the most widely blossoming garden. That is what we want for Latin America. Education is a right. It's also the best way of achieving a good life. We believe in transforming science and technology, and a great part of my hope in the future of the planet lies in science and technology, in achieving the sustainability of our way of life and the possibility of achieving buen vivir, living well for the whole of society. I have long considered that any attempt to condense in simplistic principles and laws, whether they're called dialectic materialism or rational selfishness, to try and crystallize them in such complex processes regarding the advance of human societies is doomed to failure. And I also believe that scientific and technological progress can generate greater well-being and produce greater social change than any struggle between the classes or quest for individual benefit. The development of agriculture turned nomads into sedentary societies. The Industrial Revolution changed the rural world to an urban world primarily. And the spectacular progress of information technologies has transformed industrial societies into knowledge societies. I believe that political, economic and social systems that will prevail in the future will be those that make it possible to achieve the greatest possible scientific and technological progress, but also, as is clearly very important, that this is best applied to achieve the common good. Ecuador has decided to base its development on the only inexhaustible source of wealth, that is, human talent, knowledge, innovation, and this to achieve sustainable development, but not only sustainable, also sovereign. We believe in individual freedom, but freedom without justice is very close to slavery. And this justice will not be achieved by some invisible hand, which, as Joseph Stiglitz, the Economy Nobel Prize winner, because it's invisible, nobody's seen it. So, on the contrary, justice will be achieved with very visible hands. Society becoming aware and consciously taking decisions. In other words, it will be achieved through political processes. There is no set of optimum or perfect institutions. Every country must find its own responses. Too much collective action kills the individual, but also too much individualism will kill society, and both are needed to achieve buen vivir, living well. And how far do we go? That's the institutional problem underpinning basic ideologies throughout the last 200 years. The two extremes, the minimum state of neoliberalism and the statism of classic socialism, have both failed. Clearly, each country must define its own institutions to see how far collective action should be taken, how far should individual action prevail, and this on the basis of individual national realities. And this is the fundamental challenge, namely that the human being must be supreme over capital and society over markets. One of the great errors, and you know I'm of the left, as is our government, and I say one of the great errors of the traditional left was to deny the markets. Markets are an undeniable economic reality. But one thing is having societies with a market, and another is having societies of the market societies, where lives and persons and society becomes just another asset or product of merchandise. The market is to be based on integration to emerge from the rule of capital. We need regional minimum wages that prevent the absurd competition between our countries. So we must act as a block to have a place in changing the immoral and unjust world order. And now we are entering a new phase in America. We need to free ourselves from the domination of obsolete technocrats and the blind orthodoxy that took us down so far to rock bottom, and now we must again dare to think, to generate our own academic agenda. I think Raúl Prebisch would be very happy. We don't have all the replies, but what we do have again today is Latin American thinking. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for what has been an eloquent, captivating, informative, and thought-provoking presentation, much in the proud tradition of the Prebisch lectures and the Prebisch himself. We still have time for a couple of questions before the President has to leave. I see Ambassador Delotto.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you very much, Secretary General Dr. Cadullo. My name is Alberto Delotto, and I'm the Ambassador of Argentina here at the International Missions in Geneva. This has been a great honor to listen to you, President Correa. This is a splendid lecture, very illuminating, and I feel honored to have been here today. The fact that you are giving the Prebisch Chair lecture is a further source of honor, because he was a very famous Argentinian economist who founded this organization, who founded this lecture. Also, the fact that we're meeting here in this Alliance of Civilizations room is also very symbolic. Your Excellency, you know the admiration and the friendship that exists between our two countries, and at the personal level between you and the President of the Republic of Argentina. You have said that over the last few years, in our region, we have swung between two major concepts or ideologies. One is the promotion of unfettered free trade and subjection to market forces through liberalization regulations. This is a concept that's very well understood at the national and international level, but there's another ideology which calls for a strong state with regulatory capacity, with a social dimension, and with national oversight of strategic resources. These are the two different ideologies that we swing between in our region. And to my great surprise, and the surprise of many of my generation who felt that this would never occur again in our lifetimes, this latter ideology has gained ground in our region, and we've seen that at the ballot boxes through the electoral process, including in your own country, but also recently in Bolivia, and what has happened in Chile with President Bachelet, and what may happen in a few weeks as well in Uruguay and Brazil. This concept, this ideology is gaining ground at the political level, and is even in fact become the predominant ideology in our region, if we look again Argentina, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, etc., and hopefully Brazil and Uruguay too. Now, although there have been successes and achievements, there's also been difficulties, there have also been failures. But the electorate has nonetheless supported massively your government in this model. Now, my question to you would be, in the current international and national setting, what do you believe to be the immediate challenges that the governments of Latin America have to meet, so that this trend towards the more social development, the social dimension, stronger state can be crystallized, can be bedded down, and so that we can avoid falling into the trap of returning to a past that was characterized by authoritarianism, repression, military governments, and the idea that individual initiatives should take precedence over the greater interests of society as a whole. So what do we need to do? What are the challenges we need to meet immediately in the current circumstances in today's world? Thank you. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, says President Correa Delgado. I speak some English, some French, less Spanish, but for Argentinian I needed to listen to the interpretation, I'm afraid. No, what is it? You're quite far away from me, and it was difficult for me to hear you. I believe that what you asked, well, I will come to what you asked, but I do want to make the point that we have so much affection for President Kirchner, for President Cristina Kirchner. We believe her to be a brilliant woman. We have such affection for Argentina. We have such affection for the way we work together with you in UNASUR, with the Secretary General of UNASUR and Argentinian National. We also much appreciated our working relationship at the United Nations headquarters in New York. We welcome the fact that the UNASUR building has been, a headquarters has been established in Quito, near our country, and has been given the name the Nestor Kirchner building, a further proof of how much affection and how much admiration we have for Argentina as a brother country. In the past, we saw such poor use of resources that has now been changed to deliver the successes that we've enjoyed so far. But as I've said, despite the progressive movement in Latin America, the first stage, or the first phase, where we had much room for maneuver, wiggle room, where traditional groups had been completely undone by the failure of neoliberalism and the debacle that it left in its wake, and the fact that we were seeing more and more progressive governments in Latin America beginning in 1999 with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, but he was followed by a wave of others leading most recently to Nestor Kirchner, Cristina Kirchner, to Evo Morales. This honeymoon stage is now over, that room where we had the opportunity to do anything we wanted almost. Now we have to deal with national interest groups, political groups, who are also linking up. That they are rolling out systematic campaigns attacking our governments. So the going is harder now, particularly when you look at the current economic and financial situation, which has been complicated by the drop in commodity prices and also the increasing strength of the dollar. So the door is somewhat ajar to the conservative restoration, as I like to term it. Now, how can we counter that? Of course, one of the best ways we can do that is using the media, using communication wisely. In Latin America, the media is often or always in the hands of the elite. There's not the freedom of expression that there might be in black and white on the legislative books. Those who own the newspapers, who own the television channels, are those who have the power, and these mass media often owned, as I say, by the elites of the former conservative elements, and we see day after day a drip, 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 or a flood of lies, of disinformation to try and pave the way for a return of these retroactive conservative elements. We're starting to see this, and I think it will only get worse. There are several elements that have to be taken into account, but we see that there, at the national and international levels, in Argentina, Ecuador, Bolivia, you are in Venezuela as well, you are seeing these organized groups who want to turn back time, turn back the clock. But I think this is a reflection of how things have changed, or perhaps a better political process, because a few years back you wouldn't have heard their voices at all. Such was the belief in the populist revolution, in the populist changes that we're bringing into Latin America. But I think one way of changing it is perhaps through education, so that in Latin America we have stronger civil society leaders. But that is also being hijacked. We're hearing outside, you need to create a stronger civil society. We know that that is simply doublespeak for opening the door to agents, to those who wish to infiltrate our societies and overturn all the achievements that we have managed to deliver so far. And so we need to guard against that as well. So I believe that we're in the slog of the fight now. So how do we move forward? We need unity. We need our own unity between the leftist movements at the regional and global level as well as at the national level. If the ultra-conservative right-wing groups, the reaction to what we have done, have managed to unite, then we, the progressive governments, the progressive elements, we also need to be united. We need to be on the same page. We need to be more efficient, more effective. We need to make sure that we lend a still more listening ear to our people. We need to draw closer to them, reconcile ourselves more deeply with them and their needs. And in point of fact, I have to say I don't really have much of a specific, tangible answer to give to you. I would say that the global picture is complicated. It's further complicated by this partnership between reactionary forces, both at the national and international level, posing a threat to the hard-won gains of progressivism. In addition, Latin American peoples have good hearts but short memories. I have 8 years in power. In Ecuador, you can vote at the age of 16. So when I took over the presidency of Ecuador, I was 8 years old. They, I beg your pardon, were 8 years old. So those who can now vote in the next election, 16, have no idea what Ecuador was like 8 years ago, because they are simply, they were so young. So without that historical understanding, they can perhaps be seduced by other ideas as well. So we have to make sure that we present ourselves, that we educate as well. So we need to be united, we need to be much more effective and efficient in order to make sure that the best can, and deliver tangibly the best possible living standards for our population as an ongoing process that all generations believe in what we're doing. But I think we do need to be alert, we do need to be aware, because there's a conservative renovation on its way.
Of the Philippines. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Your Excellency, I am the permanent representative of the Philippines to the United Nations. I would like to commend Your Excellency for your excellent and very eloquent presentation, or I would say lecture. We are so pleased to hear of Your Excellency's government's actions and programs that led your economic growth to be inclusive, which is, I think, the aspiration of all developing countries. Your Excellency, we would like to request you to give your reflection on the importance of policy space at the multilateral and bilateral levels, for example, in the field of trade and investment, in order to allow developing countries to have enough flexibility to ensure a pattern of inclusive and sustainable development. Thank you, Your Excellency.
I beg your pardon, there was something you said that I didn't quite understand.
Policy space?
Policy space, Your Excellency.
Policy space?
Yes,
for what?
if
Sorry?
you can give us your reflection on the importance of policy space at the multilateral and bilateral levels, for example, in the field of trade and investments, that would allow developing countries to have enough flexibility to ensure a pattern of inclusive and sustainable development. Thank you.
Sí, no entiendo muy bien.
I have to say that once again I don't really understand the question. Are you seeking space, multilateral and bilateral space? If I think I've understood it, we have to develop inclusive policies, but if you don't allow for labor flexibility, there'll be no investment. And that's what people say to us: if you don't cut taxes, then I won't invest. And you need that investment, but you also need taxes to fund social change. And I think that these things won't change under the capitalist model. I think that what will change is the attitude of people in the developed world, whose attitudes are changing as a result of the crisis in the capitalist model that they're living through. In the United States, the 1% of the population has a third of the wealth, but there was so much growth over the last 50 years that everyone's level of living was rising, even if it wasn't to those meteoric levels, so everyone was happy. But now that's not happening. We're seeing the economy break down, slow down, and stop altogether, and that's leading to greater social conflict, I beg your pardon, around the world. So one hope is that the citizens of the developed world will finally wake up to the total supremacy exercised over them by capitalism, particularly financial capitalism, will also seek to change that as well at their level amongst their governments. I think it would be very difficult to bring about change from the developing countries' perspective, from the third country perspective, particularly as isolated countries with standalone actions. If we want to protect ourselves from the abuse of the capitalist system of finance. So I would go back to what I said a little bit to respond to your question. We are being asked to develop inclusive policies, We're being asked to have skilled employment, but then when we want them to invest, then they ask us to do completely the contrary, cut taxes, which means we have less to invest in our education. So double standards. So the best way of dealing with this problem is integration, unity, partnership. Together we can oppose the restrictions that the capitalist model tries to impose upon us. We can put an end to transnational capitalism dictating what we do. If they continue to dictate what we do, it will be difficult to deliver genuine democracy. We'll end up with restricted economies, and it will be difficult to put together the different inclusive policies that we want to see out there in the world. So to have more policy space, we need once again this integration, this unity, this coming together.
Thank you, President Rafael Correa Delgado, and thank you everyone for coming to a... Okay, I'll take one more. The gentleman over there.
Presidente Correa, en nombre de los...
On behalf of the Ecuadorian students who are here in Switzerland, I would like to welcome you and congratulate you for your brilliant lecture and all that you had to say. It's a great source of honor to us as Ecuadorian to be here. I'm Paul Quaya. I'm a student in the International Studies Institute and Development Institute here in Geneva, and I'd like to ask you a question, President. You talked about a finite resource economy, natural resources in other words, and moving to the infinite economy, the knowledge-based economy, and using knowledge as a tool for individual liberty. And to do that, it satisfies our needs to live together in democracy. And I believe that's well understood by all of us, this need for knowledge. However, I would ask the question, how do you encapsulate or frame knowledge as part of the economic and development strategy and policies of your country? Thank you. The President speaking. Education is a right. The people have the right to be educated, whatever they choose to do with their lives. They have the right to be educated, to understand their place in the world, to understand the environment in which they live, to understand where they're coming from, and to identify where they'd like to go. But this also has a repercussion on the productive mechanism of our country. We have rejected the term human capital because human beings are not a tool for capitalist production. We do not serve it, but rather it serves us. So I prefer to talk about human talent, and human talent in the labor market. I don't want people to be treated the same as tractors, for example, as mere goods. We need, for example, proper wages as a better model for redistribution of wealth in a country, and that is delivered through better education and better skills. But clearly, human talent is fundamental, it's vital if we're going to increase productivity, which brings that greater added value in its wake. So for that reason, we're putting a great deal of emphasis on education, education as a right, but education also as the cornerstone of improvements in the productive sector in Ecuador, because that's one of the serious problems we're facing in the Ecuadorian economy. And we need it, for example, to be able to fund things such as our scholarship program, which is something that's already been applauded, and I'm glad that you're able to benefit as well. But with this human talent, with this knowledge of science, of technology, with the understanding thereof, then we will see what is currently a desert bloom come into flower. So we are betting on an economy based on knowledge and human talent, and of fostering that human talent on the basis of education as a right. But also this later human talent, science and technological understanding is the new basis of the Ecuadorian economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you all once again. I'm sure there'll be more questions coming on. The meeting is closed. Thank you.